Tomorrow, you could wake up in a world where your father has the legal right to execute you for intimate relationships, where certain behaviors in private could end your career instantly, and where children were trained from birth to serve the whims of emperors. You think you know about Roman culture? Here's what they don't teach in history class. The Roman Empire didn't just conquer the world, it built an entire civilization on intimate control, where every bedroom was a battlefield, and every private moment could be your death sentence. Welcome to the real Rome. You don't learn this in history classes, but for over 500 years, the Roman Empire operated the most sophisticated system of intimate control in human history. I've scoured through thousands primary sources, archaeological evidence from Pompeii, and ancient legal documents that most academics avoid discussing. What I've discovered will fundamentally change how you view ancient civilization and make you grateful for every freedom you have today. Here's what most people don't realize. We're about to journey through 7 levels of intimate horror that escalated throughout Roman history. From laws that made certain behaviors punishable by death, to women being executed for experiencing pleasure, to virgin priestesses buried alive for breaking their vows. We'll expose how emperors turned children into servants, how Romans transformed intimacy into deadly competitions, and why professional instructors performed live demonstrations in noble homes. But wait, it gets worse. All of this insanity was literally carved into their streets as religious monuments. Let's start with the most basic rule that governed every Roman's life, and death. Imagine if your private behavior determined your public status. Imagine if being perceived as passive in intimate situations meant losing your job, your citizenship, and possibly your life. In Rome, this wasn't imagination. It was law. Being labeled as submissive in private meant social death worse than actual murder. The Romans built an entire civilization on a simple, terrifying principle: dominance equals power, submission equals destruction. You think cancel culture is harsh? Romans cancelled people for their perceived intimate roles. Literally. One rumor about your private preferences could destroy a political career that took decades to build. The truly disturbing part? This wasn't some unspoken social rule. Rome codified intimate behaviors into law, creating a hierarchy that determined whether you lived as a respected citizen or died as a social outcast. Let me give you the most famous example, one that nearly changed the course of world history. Julius Caesar, the man who would conquer Gaul and transform Rome into an empire, spent his entire life fighting rumors about what happened when he was 19 years old. During a diplomatic mission to King Nicomedes IV of Bithynia, young Caesar allegedly took a submissive role in their private arrangements. Here's what most people don't realize. This single rumor followed him for 40 years. His enemies called him the Queen of Bithynia in the Senate. During his triumph parades, moments meant to celebrate his greatest military victories, soldiers sang mocking songs about Caesar being every woman's man and every man's woman. The poet Catullus wrote verses about Caesar's supposed submission that Romans memorized and repeated at parties. Imagine conquering entire nations, becoming the most powerful man in the world, and still having people mock you for something that allegedly happened in private 4 decades ago. But wait, it gets worse. The Romans didn't just mock, they legislated. The Lex Scantinia, passed in 149 BC, made passive intimate behavior by freeborn males a crime punishable by enormous fines, exile, or even death. The law was so severe that accusations alone could destroy lives. We have documented cases of senators expelled from office not for corruption or incompetence, but for rumors about their private roles. Take the case of a senator whose name was literally erased from records. That's how shameful this was considered. He was expelled from the Senate after slaves reported witnessing him in a submissive position with his wife. Yes, you read that correctly. Certain acts with your own spouse could end your political career. The Romans had a special term for this, os impurum, impure mouth. Once labeled with this designation, you were considered permanently contaminated. People wouldn't share meals with you, wouldn't let you kiss their children, wouldn't even speak to you in public. The truly insane part was the mathematical precision of their intimacy hierarchy. At the top sat the emperor. He could dominate anyone and maintain his dignity. Below him, senators could dominate anyone except the emperor and fellow senators. Citizens could dominate freedmen, slaves, and non-citizens. Freedmen could only dominate slaves. Slaves could dominate no one without permission. Breaking this hierarchy wasn't just embarrassing, it was criminal. Here's a specific example that shows how seriously Romans took this system. A wealthy citizen named Lucius was caught in a submissive position with his own slave. The legal consequences were devastating. First, he lost his citizenship rights. Then, his property was confiscated. His children were disinherited. His wife was forced to divorce him to protect her own status. Finally, he was exiled from Rome forever, all because he took the wrong role with someone he literally owned. But the system went even deeper. Romans developed an entire vocabulary to categorize and shame intimate positions. These weren't slurs, they were legal categories that determined your rights under Roman law. A man labeled as passive faced daily violence and humiliation. These terms appeared in court documents, determined legal standing, and shaped social interactions. The psychological impact was staggering. Roman men lived in constant fear of accusation. They developed elaborate codes of behavior to avoid even the appearance of passivity. Standing the wrong way, gesturing too softly, even the tone of your voice could trigger suspicions. We have letters from Roman fathers to their sons filled with paranoid instructions about maintaining masculine dominance in every aspect of life. Why did dominance equal power in Roman minds? The answer reveals the dark heart of their civilization. Romans saw the world through the lens of conquest. Just as Roman legions dominated enemy territories, Roman men had to dominate others to prove their status. Being dominated meant being conquered, being feminized, being reduced to the status of a woman or slave. In a society built on military might, intimate submission was equivalent to battlefield defeat. This mentality infected every aspect of Roman life. Business deals were described in dominance terms. Political alliances were framed as who was on top. Even religious rituals emphasized the importance of maintaining the active role. The connection between intimate dominance and political authority was so strong that emperors often proved their power through public displays of aggressive behavior. Modern psychological analysis reveals how this system maintained social order through intimate terror. By making certain positions literally criminal, Rome created a self-policing society where everyone watched everyone else for signs of weakness. The fear of accusation kept citizens in line more effectively than any army. It was brilliant in its cruelty. Rome conquered the world by first conquering its own bedrooms. Makes modern power dynamics look like playground games, doesn't it? Today we debate consent and equality. Romans debated whether taking the wrong position should result in exile or execution. We worry about our reputations on social media. Romans worried about being buried alive for a rumor about their private lives. But if you think that's twisted, wait until you hear what happened to women who dared to enjoy intimacy. Now let's talk about how Rome literally outlawed female enjoyment of intimacy. Imagine if experiencing pleasure during intimate moments was a crime punishable by death. Imagine being forced to lie completely still, showing no emotion, making no sound, while your body's natural responses could get you executed. This wasn't some dystopian fiction. This was daily reality for Roman women. Rome built an entire legal system around a paradox that would break modern minds. They celebrated male desire while making female enjoyment a capital offense. You complain about intimate performance anxiety? Roman women performed not enjoying themselves to stay alive. The consequences for showing pleasure were catastrophic. A woman who moved too much, made sounds of enjoyment, or showed any sign of pleasure could face accusations of adultery, even with her own husband. The truly disturbing part? Her own father had the legal right to execute her for it. Augustus, Rome's first emperor, passed a series of moral reforms in 18 BC that turned female intimacy into a death trap. The Lex Julia de Adulteriis Coascendis didn't just punish adultery, it criminalized female agency entirely. Under this law, a father who discovered his daughter had engaged in premarital relations could legally execute both her and her partner on the spot. No trial, no appeal, just execution. Here's what most people don't realize. Augustus used this law to exile his own daughter, Julia the Elder. Despite being the emperor's daughter, despite being married with 5 children, Julia was banished to a remote island for the crime of enjoying intimacy too publicly. Her specific offense? Attending parties where she allegedly showed enthusiasm during private encounters. Augustus forbade anyone from visiting her, banned wine from her diet, and declared that she should be buried outside the family tomb. The Emperor of Rome destroyed his own daughter for experiencing pleasure. But wait, it gets worse. Roman medical experts created an entire mythology around female desire designed to terrorize women into numbness. They claimed that female arousal caused hysteria, insanity, and demonic possession. Dr. Soranus of Ephesus, considered Rome's greatest gynecologist, wrote that women who experienced too much pleasure would suffer from wandering uterus, a condition where the womb would detach and float around the body, causing madness. The treatments for female arousal were essentially medical torture. We have detailed records of the procedures. Women showing signs of enjoyment were subjected to cooling treatments, forced to sit in ice water for hours, drink potions made from lead and mercury, or undergo fumigation where they breathed toxic smoke to calm the womb. Wealthy women paid fortunes for doctors to essentially poison them into numbness. Consider the case of Sempronia, a noble woman whose story survives in fragments. After her husband reported that she seemed to enjoy their wedding night excessively, she was sent to Rome's leading medical authorities. The treatment regimen was horrifying: daily ice baths at dawn, forced consumption of bitter herbs that caused illness, bloodletting to reduce passion, application of lead powder to cool the body. After 6 months of this medical torture, Sempronia had learned to lie perfectly still during intimate encounters, showing no response whatsoever. The doctors declared her cured. The double standard was breathtaking in its cruelty. The same men who demanded intimate numbness from their wives openly celebrated their own conquests. A Roman man could engage with slaves, prostitutes, and non-citizens without consequence. He could boast about his virility in the Senate. He could commission statues celebrating his prowess. But if his wife smiled during intimacy, death sentence. Roman women developed elaborate survival strategies that read like psychological horror. They created secret networks to teach each other the performance of numbness. Older women instructed younger ones in the art of emotional suppression, how to breathe silently, how to keep facial muscles relaxed, how to prevent involuntary responses. We have fragments of letters where mothers write to daughters with advice like, think of household accounts during the act, and bite your tongue if you feel pleasure rising. The psychological damage was catastrophic and generational. Roman women learned to dissociate from their own bodies as a survival mechanism. They passed down trauma like family heirlooms, mothers teaching daughters that feeling anything during intimacy could kill them. The entire female population of Rome was essentially trained to develop dysfunction as a life-preserving skill. But the system went even deeper than individual oppression. Roman law made women's bodies public property subject to state control. The concept of female consent didn't exist. Women were transferred from father to husband like property deeds. A woman's intimacy belonged to her male guardian, and any expression of personal desire was theft from her owner. The legal term was stuprum, any intimate act that violated male ownership, regardless of the woman's feelings. Here's a specific legal case that shows the insanity. A woman named Claudia was accused of adultery because she was seen laughing with a male friend in the market. The evidence against her? Witnesses testified that she appeared flushed and smiled excessively in his presence. Her husband divorced her, her father disowned her, and she lost custody of her children. She was never accused of actually having relations, just of appearing to enjoy a conversation with a man. The religious justification made it even worse. Roman priests taught that female pleasure angered the gods and caused natural disasters. They blamed crop failures on women's enjoyment. They attributed military defeats to wives enjoying their husbands too much. The Vestal Virgins, Rome's most sacred priestesses, were held up as the ideal. Women so pure they felt nothing, wanted nothing, experienced nothing. Why did Rome criminalize female pleasure? The answer exposes the empire's deepest fears. Roman men were terrified of female desire because they couldn't control it through force. You could conquer territories, enslave populations, and dominate other men through violence. But female desire? That required women's participation, and participation implied choice. In a society built on domination, female agency was an existential threat. The empire-wide system of intimate control reached into every bedroom, every marriage, every private moment. Husbands spied on wives, slaves reported on mistresses. Children were taught to watch their mothers for signs of improper enjoyment. Rome turned every family into a surveillance state where women's bodies were the battlefield. Makes Victorian prudishness look sexually liberated, doesn't it? We debate whether women should perform pleasure. Roman women died for having genuine responses. The lasting impact on Western attitudes echoes through centuries. Every time someone suggests women shouldn't enjoy intimacy too much, they're channeling ancient Roman terror. Speaking of religious control, let's examine what happened when virgins broke their sacred vows. But the most horrifying fate awaited Rome's sacred virgins who dared to experience human touch. Imagine if losing your purity meant being buried alive while the city celebrates. Imagine being selected at age 6 to serve a goddess who demands 30 years of perfect chastity, knowing that one moment of human weakness equals death by suffocation in an underground tomb. You think purity culture is extreme today? Romans turned virginity into a death cult that makes modern religious celibacy look like a casual suggestion. The Vestal Virgins were Rome's most powerful women, and its most terrified. They controlled the sacred flame that supposedly protected the empire, handled state secrets, and enjoyed privileges no other women possessed. They could own property, make wills, and travel without male guardians. But here's what most people don't realize. They paid for this power with 3 decades of intimate terror, where a single kiss could mean dying alone in the dark. The execution method was specifically designed to be a living nightmare. When a Vestal was condemned for breaking her vow of chastity, Rome didn't just execute her, they buried her alive in an underground chamber called the Campus Sceleratus, the evil field. But wait, it gets worse. They couldn't spill a Vestal's blood because she was sacred, so they created a legal fiction that she wasn't being executed at all. She was simply being sent to the goddess. Here's how the burial ritual worked, and the details will haunt you. First, the condemned Vestal was stripped of her sacred garments and dressed like a bride, because death was framed as her marriage to the underworld. She was bound with leather straps and placed in a closed litter so no one could hear her cries as she was carried through the city. The entire population was required to attend in absolute silence. Anyone who spoke or looked away faced punishment. At the burial site, workers had prepared an underground room just large enough for a bed, a lamp with 1 day's worth of oil, and a small amount of bread and water. The truly disturbing part? They included these provisions so they could claim they weren't killing her. They were just putting her in a room where she happened to die. The psychological torture of including just enough supplies to prolong death but not enough to survive was intentional. The condemned Vestal was forced to climb down a ladder into the chamber herself. She had to participate in her own burial. Once inside, the ladder was removed, the opening was sealed with earth, and the ground was smoothed over as if nothing was there. She died slowly in the dark, probably taking several days to suffocate or die of thirst. Above ground, the city returned to normal life while she clawed at the earth ceiling until her fingers bled. Let me tell you about Vestal Cornelia, whose execution under Emperor Domitian shows how political these deaths could be. Cornelia had served faithfully for over 20 years when she was suddenly accused of impurity. The evidence? None. Domitian needed a scapegoat for military defeats and decided that the gods must be angry about impure Vestals. Cornelia protested her innocence, even as they dressed her in burial clothes. Witnesses reported that she cried out, "How can Caesar call me impure when he has conquered and triumphed during my service?" It didn't matter. She was buried alive to satisfy imperial paranoia. But the Vestals weren't the only ones who died. Any man caught with a Vestal faced an arguably worse fate. He was beaten to death with rods in the Forum Romanum, Rome's most public space, while crowds watched and cheered. The executioners were required to continue beating until the body was unrecognizable. The process could take hours. Take the case of Marcus Antonius, a young nobleman who fell in love with a Vestal named Marcia. Their affair was discovered when slaves reported seeing them exchange letters. Marcus was dragged to the forum, stripped, and beaten with rods until his bones were visible through the damaged flesh. Witnesses say he stopped screaming after the first hour, but the beating continued for 3 more. Marcia watched from a window before being taken to her underground tomb. The methods for detecting broken virginity were invasive and humiliating. Vestals underwent regular physical examinations by priests who claimed they could identify lost purity through mystical signs. They examined everything from the color of their eyes to the texture of their hair. Any physical change could trigger an accusation. Gained weight? must be pregnant. Lost weight, must be pining for a lover. Skin too pale? Guilty conscience? Skin too flushed? Secret passion. The surveillance network around Vestals was staggering. They were followed by guards, watched by slaves, monitored by priests. Every word, gesture, and glance was reported and analyzed. They couldn't speak to men without witnesses. They couldn't leave their house without escorts. They couldn't even smile at male relatives without risking accusation. We have records of Vestals being investigated for laughing too loudly at dinner parties. False accusations were common and politically motivated. Rivals could destroy each other by accusing their enemy's daughter or sister serving as a Vestal. The case of Vestal Claudia shows how these accusations worked. Her brother was running for consul when his opponent spread rumors about Claudia's purity. Despite no evidence, she was forced to undergo a public trial where intimate details of her daily life were exposed. She survived only by performing a miracle, praying to the goddess Vesta to prove her innocence through divine intervention. When the sacred flames suddenly flared higher, the crowd declared her pure. How many innocent Vestals died who couldn't produce convenient miracles? The selection process itself was psychological torture. Girls between ages 6 and 10 were chosen by lottery from Rome's noble families. Imagine being a 6-year-old child, taken from your parents, told that touching another human romantically for the next 30 years means death. The indoctrination began immediately. They were taught that their purity literally protected Rome from destruction. Every military defeat, natural disaster, or plague was potentially their fault for impure thoughts. Many Vestals cracked under the pressure. The self-harm rates were astronomical but covered up to maintain the institution's prestige. We have fragments of letters from Vestals describing nightmares, hallucinations, and self-destructive behaviors. One wrote, "I dream of the earth opening beneath me. I wake gasping for air that isn't there." Another described compulsively checking her reflection for signs of impurity that priests might detect. The 30-year term was specifically calculated for maximum cruelty. Girls entered at 6 to 10 years old and couldn't leave until 36 to 40 past prime childbearing years in Roman society. Even if they survived with sanity intact, they emerged too old for marriage and children by Roman standards. Many retired Vestals lived as social outcasts, too strange and damaged for normal life after 3 decades of enforced purity. The religious justification was that Vesta, goddess of the hearth, required virgin servants to tend her eternal flame. If the flame went out, Rome would fall. If a Vestal lost her virginity, the flame would die. This circular logic trapped generations of women in intimate terror. The psychological control was brilliant in its simplicity, make women believe their bodies could literally destroy civilization. Why did virginity hold such religious power? Romans believed female purity contained magical protective properties. Virgin blood, virgin tears, even virgin breath were thought to have supernatural powers. But this power was fragile. One intimate thought could corrupt it forever. Vestals were essentially human talismans, whose value lay in what they didn't do, didn't feel, didn't experience. The institution lasted over 1,000 years, from Rome's founding to 394 AD, when Christian Emperor Theodosius finally disbanded it. Think about that. A millennium of young girls buried alive for experiencing human desire. Thousands of women suffocating in the dark because they felt what every human naturally feels. The screams from underground chambers that no one was allowed to hear. Makes modern religious celibacy look like a casual suggestion, doesn't it? At least modern clergy who break their vows face disappointment, not suffocation. The echo of virgin sacrifice continues in every purity pledge, every father-daughter covenant. We've just replaced burial chambers with psychological ones. If sacred virgins faced death, imagine what happened in the emperor's bedroom. Now we enter the nightmare realm of imperial bedrooms, where human children became living servants. Imagine if world leaders could legally turn your children into personal servants. Imagine if the most powerful man on earth collected infants to train as attendants, hosted inappropriate dinners as state entertainment, and married castrated boys in public ceremonies. You think powerful men abuse their positions today? Roman emperors made modern scandals look like amateur hour. Because they didn't hide their perversions, they made them state policy. The Roman Empire granted its emperors absolute immunity from normal social rules. Whatever sick fantasy crossed an imperial mind became reality. enforced by legions and funded by taxes. The progression from power to perversion was predictable and horrifying. Each emperor tried to outdo his predecessors in extremism, creating a competitive spiral of depravity that destroyed countless lives. Let's start with Emperor Tiberius, who retired to the island of Capri and turned it into a training facility that defies modern comprehension. Ancient historian Suetonius, who had access to imperial archives, recorded details that most modern academics refuse to translate fully. Tiberius created what he called his little fish, children trained from infancy to perform aquatic services. Here's what most people don't realize about the systematic nature of this horror. Tiberius had pools constructed specifically for these activities. Children as young as toddlers were trained to swim between his legs and perform services while he floated. He called them his minnows. The training began before they could speak, conditioning infants to associate water with servitude. Those who cried or resisted were drowned in the same pools. But wait, it gets worse. Tiberius collected what he called tight rosebuds, young boys at the specific age where their bodies were just beginning to develop. He had procurement agents across the empire whose sole job was identifying and kidnapping children at this exact developmental stage. Parents who resisted had their entire families crucified. The lucky children died quickly. The unlucky ones aged out and were discarded like broken toys. The infrastructure required for these operations reveals the true horror. Tiberius employed teams of trainers, guards, procurers, and disposers. There were dormitories full of children in various stages of training. Medical staff kept them alive but compliant through drugs and specialized diets. Accountants tracked expenses for what official records called theatrical supplies, a euphemism for child servants. Then came Caligula, who made his uncle Tiberius look restrained. Caligula didn't just commit inappropriate acts with family members, he turned it into performance art. He engaged inappropriately with all three of his sisters publicly at state banquets while forcing senators to watch and applaud. When his favorite sister Drusilla died, he declared her a goddess and made worship of her mandatory. The truly insane part was the religious doctrine Caligula created around imperial behavior. He claimed that as a living god, normal human taboos didn't apply to him. He compared himself to Jupiter, who married his sister Juno. Anyone who questioned the divinity of his inappropriate relationships faced execution for atheism. Imagine being forced to worship the abuse you witnessed or die for impiety. Caligula's intimate terrorism extended beyond his family. He would invite noble couples to dinner, examine the wives like cattle, then take whoever appealed to him to his bedroom, while the husband waited at the table. He'd return and critique the woman's performance in explicit detail to her husband and other guests. One senator's wife refused him, so Caligula had her stripped at a party and auctioned her virginity to the highest bidder while her husband watched. But even Caligula's depravity pales before Nero, who achieved new levels of horror through theatrical innovation. Nero castrated a boy named Sporus because he resembled Nero's dead wife. He then married Sporus in a public ceremony, complete with bridal veil and dowry, forcing the mutilated child to play the role of empress. Roman citizens were required to celebrate this wedding or face treason charges. Nero's other innovations included what he called beast games. He would have himself released from a cage dressed in animal skins, then attack the private parts of men and women tied to stakes. This wasn't private perversion, it was public entertainment at the arena. Thousands watched their emperor simulate being a wild animal assaulting bound victims. The crowd was required to cheer or face accusations of disloyalty. The architectural evidence of imperial perversion survives today. Nero's Golden House included rotating bedrooms with ceiling panels that opened to shower guests with flowers and perfume during inappropriate gatherings. Hidden passages allowed him to watch guests without their knowledge. Special chambers had different themes. One recreated a forest for hunting servants. Another simulated the heavens, where Nero could pretend to assault gods and goddesses portrayed by victims painted gold and silver. Each emperor's court developed its own vocabulary of perversion. These weren't slang terms. They were official court positions with salaries and ranks. The positions had specific duties, training requirements, and advancement opportunities within the imperial service structure. The normalization of imperial perversion corrupted Roman society from top to bottom. Senators competed to offer their children to emperors. hoping for political favor. Mothers trained daughters in techniques to please imperial tastes. Fathers castrated sons to make them more appealing as imperial servants. What started as imperial sickness became aspirational behavior for social climbers. The psychological profiles of these tyrants share common patterns. Each started with relatively normal desires that escalated once they realized no one could stop them. The ability to fulfill any fantasy immediately led to boredom. With conventional pleasures, they needed increasingly extreme acts to feel anything. Power didn't just corrupt, it annihilated their ability to see others as human. The court enablers were almost as monstrous as the emperors themselves. Freedmen built careers on procuring increasingly exotic victims. They maintained networks of spies in every province, tracking beautiful children like inventory. They developed drugs to keep victims compliant but conscious. They disposed of bodies when emperors tired of their toys. These men became wealthy beyond imagination through systematic child trafficking. But here's what truly shows the scope of imperial terror. The infrastructure survived individual emperors. When Tiberius died, his successor Caligula inherited not just the throne but the entire system, the trainers, the procurers, the facilities. When Nero fell, his successor found detailed records of victims, suppliers, and techniques. The imperial abuse system was as organized as the tax collection system, and arguably more efficient. The rare attempts at reform reveal how entrenched the system was. Emperor Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, tried to dismantle some of the worst practices. He closed certain facilities, freed some victims, executed some procurers. But the system simply went underground. Senators who had grown wealthy supplying imperial appetites fought back. Marcus Aurelius's own son, Commodus, would restore and expand every perversion his father had tried to eliminate. Makes modern political scandals look quaint by comparison. Today's powerful men hide their crimes, pay for silence, fear exposure. Roman emperors advertised their perversions as divine prerogatives. They didn't have victims. They had religious sacrifices to imperial divinity. They didn't commit crimes. They transcended human law through godhood. But emperors weren't the only ones pushing boundaries. Wait until you hear about Roman competitions. You think modern society is obsessed with performance? Romans turned intimacy into a competitive sport. Imagine if intimate marathons were broadcast like the Olympics. Imagine if your city gave civic honors for endurance performance, if wealthy matrons publicly competed with professionals in intimate contests, if gladiators earned freedom through physical athletics instead of combat. You binge Netflix. Romans binged human performances with the same casual entertainment value, except their shows featured real people destroying themselves for applause. Rome didn't just normalize public intimacy, it gamified it. They created formal competitions with rules, judges, and scoring systems. Winners received prizes, fame, and social advancement. Losers faced humiliation, slavery, or death. The truly disturbing part? These weren't underground perversions but mainstream entertainment attended by senators, merchants, and families. The most legendary intimate competition in Roman history involved Empress Messalina, wife of Emperor Claudius. According to Pliny the Elder, who recorded it as historical fact, Messalina challenged Rome's most famous courtesan, Sylla, to an endurance contest. The rules were simple. Whoever could service more clients in a single night won. Here's what most people don't realize about the systematic nature of this competition. They held it in an establishment on the Subura, Rome's entertainment district. Official judges tracked each encounter. Slaves kept hydration stations stocked. Doctors stood by to examine contestants for injuries. The competition began at sunset, with crowds gathering to place bets. Sylla, the professional, paced herself efficiently. She had techniques developed over years, positions that minimized exhaustion, recovery methods between partners, mental dissociation strategies. By dawn, she had serviced 23 clients and declared herself finished, exhausted but satisfied with what she assumed was victory. But Messalina was just getting started. The Empress, driven by imperial competitiveness and possible stimulant drugs, continued taking clients even after Sylla conceded. She reached 25 clients and kept going. Historical accounts say she only stopped when Claudius's freedmen forcibly removed her, still unsatisfied and demanding more competitors. She had won, but victory wasn't enough. She wanted to establish a record no one could break. The clinical approach to this competition reveals Roman attitudes toward intimacy as athletics. They tracked statistics like modern sports analysts. How long did each encounter last? What techniques were used? How much recovery time between partners? Messalina's victory was recorded in the same matter-of-fact tone historians used for military campaigns or architectural achievements. But Messalina's competition was just the most famous example. Rome had an entire culture of intimate competitions. Gladiator schools used such contests as training for stamina and pain tolerance. Winners earned privileges, better food, private cells, choice of partners for pleasure rather than competition. The connection between violence and intimacy was explicit. The same physicality that made a good fighter made a good intimate athlete. Wealthy Romans hosted private competitions at their villas with elaborate themes. One senator held annual Olympian contests where participants competed in Greek-inspired intimate athletics. Events included endurance, quantity, and creativity. Winners received golden trophies displayed proudly in their homes. The scoring systems were surprisingly sophisticated. Judges, usually older citizens, considered past their prime used detailed rubrics. Points for technique, stamina, partner satisfaction, and showmanship. Deductions for inability to complete positions, premature completion, or requiring excessive recovery. Some competitions included audience voting for crowd favorite awards. Public events took this to another level. These weren't spontaneous gatherings, but organized events with entry fees and prize money. Promoters advertised them like gladiator matches. Tomorrow at the Baths of Agrippa, Marcus the Mighty versus Gaius, the enduring in feats of intimate prowess. Citizens bought tickets, vendors sold snacks, children watched from viewing galleries. The rules for these public competitions were posted on stone tablets. Standard matches lasted from sunset to sunrise. Competitors could withdraw at any time but forfeited prizes and faced public mockery. Stimulants were not only allowed but provided by organizers, special wines mixed with herbs, primitive enhancers, even dangerous substances like powdered beetles that increased blood flow but could cause heart failure. Women's competitions had their own horrifying dynamics. Unlike men who competed voluntarily for glory, many female participants were slaves or desperate freedwomen competing for survival. Winners might earn enough to buy freedom or feed their children. Losers often suffered permanent physical damage. We have medical texts describing common competition injuries, torn tissues, dangerous inflammation, infections that killed slowly. The gladiator connection deserves special attention because it shows how Rome weaponized intimacy. After victories in the arena, gladiators could be rented for intimate encounters. Women and men bid astronomical sums for nights with champion fighters. But here's the sick twist. Some gladiators earned freedom, not through combat victories, but through intimate performance for wealthy patrons. The infrastructure supporting these competitions was extensive. Training facilities where aspiring competitors practiced techniques, medical specialists who treated competition-related injuries, betting houses that set odds and took wagers, even regulatory bodies that certified official competitions versus unsanctioned events. Rome bureaucratized competitive intimacy like any other public entertainment. Drug use was rampant and dangerous. Competitors consumed potions made from toxic plants, animal organs, and minerals like mercury. One popular stimulant was made from crushed beetles that caused prolonged arousal but also kidney failure. Deaths during competitions were common enough that organizers kept funeral pyres ready. Dying for intimate glory was considered honorable, like dying in the arena. The psychological damage to participants was severe, but ignored. Competitors developed what modern psychology would recognize as dissociative disorders, the ability to completely separate mind from body during intimate acts. Many became incapable of normal relationships, only able to perform in competitive contexts. Retired champions often harmed themselves, unable to adjust to life without the crowd's roar. Children's exposure to these competitions was particularly damaging. Roman parents brought children to watch, believing it was educational. Boys learned that intimate prowess determined masculine worth. Girls learned that their bodies were performance venues. We have accounts of children playing competition games, mimicking what they'd seen adults do for prizes. The normalization started early and created generations of Romans who saw intimacy as public sport rather than private connection. The economic ecosystem around intimate competitions was massive. Trainers charged huge fees to prepare competitors. Merchants sold equipment, special oils, performance-enhancing drugs, recovery tonics. Artists created commemorative sculptures of famous victories. Poets wrote odes to legendary performances. Intimate athletics generated revenue comparable to gladiatorial games. Some competitions had themed variations that pushed boundaries even further. Mythological contests where participants reenacted divine, intimate exploits. Historical competitions recreating famous encounters from the past. Exotic championships featuring positions imported from conquered territories. Each variation required specialized training and equipment, creating entire industries around intimate innovation. The record-keeping was meticulous. Roman historians tracked intimate achievements like military victories. Who held the endurance record? Which position earned highest scores? What was the maximum number of partners in a single competition? These weren't private tallies, but public knowledge, carved into stone monuments and preserved in official archives. Makes modern hookup culture look romantically conservative, doesn't it? We worry about dating app addiction while Romans literally died competing for intimate records. The echoes persist in modern culture's emphasis on performance over connection, in the gamification of romantic conquest, in the reduction of human intimacy to athletic achievement. Speaking of performance, Romans employed professional instructors you won't believe. But the truly insane part? Romans hired human beings as living, intimate education manuals. Imagine if intimate education meant watching live demonstrations by professionals. Imagine attending your wedding rehearsal where trained experts showed you exactly how to perform on your wedding night, not with diagrams or dolls, but with their own bodies in real time. You learned about intimacy from books or videos? Romans learned from live human performances that would be illegal in every country today. The Spintriae were Rome's professional intimate demonstrators, and their existence reveals depths of systematic perversion that historians still struggle to explain. These weren't courtesans or entertainers, they were academic specialists who turned their bodies into educational tools. The Romans approached intimate education with the same systematic methodology they applied to engineering aqueducts or training legions. The selection process for Spintriae began in childhood, and the criteria were specific to the point of insanity. Scouts searched for children with particular physical attributes: extreme flexibility, unusual stamina, specific body proportions that allowed for exotic positions. They looked for double-jointed limbs, abnormal muscle control, and high pain tolerance. These children were purchased or taken from families and began training before puberty. Here's what most people don't realize about Spintriae training academies. They operated like athletic schools, with dormitories, training schedules, and graduated curriculum. Young Spintriae spent years learning to contort their bodies into positions that would hospitalize normal humans. They practiced specific breathing techniques to maintain positions that cut off air supply. They developed muscle memory for sequences that defied anatomical logic. The mortality rate during training was staggering. We have partial records from one academy showing that fewer than half of trainees survived to graduation. Deaths came from internal injuries, broken bones that pierced organs, and infections from repeated tissue damage. But here's the truly sick part. Dead trainees were considered acceptable losses in creating perfect human demonstration tools. The standard demonstration unit was 3 Spintriae 2 performers and 1 narrator who provided technical commentary during the act. They would arrive at noble homes like any other tutor, carrying specialized equipment in discrete cases. The demonstrations took place in whatever room the client designated, often with family members and household slaves required to attend and take notes. Wedding night instruction was their most common booking. Roman brides, especially young ones from noble families, were expected to be pure, but also somehow skilled in techniques that pleased their husbands. The solution? Live demonstrations the night before the wedding. The bride would watch Spintriae perform every position and technique her new husband might demand, with detailed explanations of how to breathe, where to place weight, and how to avoid injury. The psychological trauma inflicted on these brides was devastating. Imagine being a 14-year-old girl, raised in relative shelter, suddenly forced to watch adults perform acts that violated every natural instinct while knowing you'd be expected to replicate them tomorrow. Many brides became violently ill during demonstrations. Some fainted. The spintriae were trained to continue performing regardless of audience reactions. But wedding instruction was just the beginning. Noble families hired spintriae for regular household demonstrations to train their slaves in techniques for pleasing guests. These sessions were conducted like corporate training seminars. Slaves stood in rows taking notes while spintriae demonstrated positions, pacing, and responses. Slaves who failed to master techniques faced punishment or sale. Competition preparation elevated spintriae services to another level. Romans training for intimate competitions hired teams of spintriae for intensive coaching. These sessions lasted days, with spintriae demonstrating endurance techniques, recovery positions, and methods for maintaining arousal during marathon sessions. They shared trade secrets: which muscles to strengthen, how to dissociate from pain, what substances enhance performance without causing immediate death. The spintriae demonstration manuals went beyond basic positions. They had specialized performances for every preference and fetish. Some specialized in restraint techniques that maximized control without causing permanent damage. Others demonstrated role-playing scenarios with elaborate costumes and props. A few elite spintriae could perform positions inspired by mythological transformations, humans imitating animals, gods taking multiple forms, shape-shifting during the act itself. Children's exposure to spintriae demonstrations was routine and catastrophic. Roman parents believed early education prevented ignorance and weakness. Boys as young as 10 attended demonstrations to learn dominant techniques. Girls watched to understand submission. The spintriae had special educational routines designed for young audiences, slightly less extreme, but still involving full nudity and explicit acts. The trauma of watching adults perform like educational puppets damaged entire generations. The medical knowledge spintriae possessed was extensive and disturbing. They understood anatomy at levels that surprised even Roman doctors. They knew exactly how far joints could bend before breaking, how long oxygen deprivation could last before brain damage, which positions caused internal injuries versus surface pain. This knowledge came from experience. Their own bodies were laboratories for intimate experimentation. Some spintriae achieved celebrity status. Marcus the Flexible could dislocate his hips at will to achieve impossible angles. Livia the Enduring once demonstrated for 12 hours straight without breaks. Gaius the Innovative created 17 new positions that became standard in Roman bedrooms. These celebrities commanded huge fees and performed at imperial parties where their demonstrations became entertainment rather than education. The equipment spintriae used reveals the industrial scale of their operations. Custom furniture designed for specific positions, restraint systems with precise tension controls, mirrors arranged at calculated angles for optimal viewing, measurement tools to ensure correct positioning. Some demonstrations looked more like engineering projects than intimate encounters, with spintriae using marked floor patterns and timed sequences. The business structure around spintriae was sophisticated. Agencies managed bookings and set prices based on demonstration complexity. Insurance policies covered injuries during performances. Contracts specified exactly which acts would be demonstrated, and liability for audience members who attempted replication. Some spintriae formed guilds with standardized training and certification processes. Retirement for spintriae was rare and brutal. Bodies destroyed by years of extreme positions often failed by age 30. Those who survived faced crippling arthritis, chronic pain, and psychological damage from years of public performance. Rome had no pension system for broken human demonstration tools. Many ended up begging in streets, their famous flexibility replaced by permanent contortion from accumulated injuries. The psychological profiles of spintriae reveal complex trauma patterns. They developed extreme dissociation abilities, describing out-of-body experiences during demonstrations. Many couldn't form normal intimate relationships, only able to perform when watched by audiences. Some developed exhibition compulsions, unable to stop demonstrating even when their bodies screamed for rest. The mental damage matched the physical destruction. The influence of spintriae on Roman intimate culture was profound and lasting. Their demonstrations set impossible standards that regular citizens tried to match, causing widespread injuries. Their techniques became required knowledge for social advancement. Their performances turned intimacy into technical execution rather than emotional connection. They created a culture where intimacy was academic subject rather than human experience. Makes modern adult education look tasteful and educational, doesn't it? At least, digital content doesn't require human beings to destroy their bodies for live demonstration. The difference between viewing recorded content and watching living humans perform on command in your bedroom is the difference between horror movie and actual torture. All of this insanity was literally carved into their streets. And if you walked through any Roman city, you couldn't escape the stone symbols pointing the way. Imagine if every street sign was shaped like reproductive organs. Imagine if your children played hopscotch around giant stone symbols, if your garden statues were massive phallic monuments, if military victories were commemorated with genital monuments. You think Times Square is explicit? Roman cities were basically open-air reproductive museums where every corner displayed intimate organs as casually as we display stop signs. The archaeological evidence from Pompeii alone reveals the staggering extent of public phallic display. Over 40 stone symbols are carved into street corners, and that's just what survived the volcanic eruption. These weren't hidden in alleys, they were on main thoroughfares, at child height, worn smooth by thousands of hands touching them for luck. But here's what most people don't realize. These phallic carvings served as navigation. The stone symbols literally pointed the way to entertainment districts. Size indicated quality. The larger the carved symbol, the more expensive the establishment. Multiple symbols in a row created a trail, like reproductive breadcrumbs leading customers through the city. Some had additional elements that indicated special services. Others included inscriptions with prices and specialties. It was GPS powered by genitalia. But the navigation symbols were just the beginning. Every Roman home, from slave quarters to senatorial villas, displayed protective phalluses. The god Priapus, depicted as a grotesquely endowed man threatening thieves with his massive member, stood guard in gardens. These weren't subtle symbols. We're talking 6-foot statues with prominent features painted bright red. Children played around them. Families picnicked in their shadow. The normalization was complete. The religious significance went beyond mere decoration. Romans believed the phallus protected against the evil eye, a curse cast through jealous glances. Every doorway needed phallic protection. New babies wore reproductive amulets. Brides touched stone symbols for fertility. Soldiers carried portable charms into battle. The archaeological record shows reproductive symbols everywhere, carved into furniture, molded into bread, painted on walls, worn as jewelry. Here's a specific example from Pompeii that shows how integrated these symbols were into daily life. At a bakery on Via dell'Abbondanza, archaeologists found ovens with phallic-shaped molds for making bread. Above the ovens, a massive stone symbol protected the baking process. The bakery's sign? A carved relief showing Priapus weighing his enormous member against a bag of gold. Customers bought symbolically shaped bread under a phallic sign from ovens protected by reproductive carvings. It was symbols all the way down. The military took phallic protection to extremes. Hadrian's Wall, built to protect Roman Britain from barbarian invasions, has reproductive carvings every few hundred meters. Roman soldiers believed that displaying their symbols, literally, would terrify enemies and protect the frontier. They wore reproductive amulets called fascina as standard military equipment. Victory monuments featured conquered enemies being dominated by symbolic Roman power. Defeat meant submission, even in stone. But wait, it gets even more disturbing. Public festivals featured massive phallic processions. During the Liberalia, celebrating the god Liber, citizens paraded a gigantic wooden phallus through the streets. Respectable matrons were required to publicly crown the symbol with flowers. Children sang songs praising the reproductive organ's power. The entire city participated in what was essentially a religious celebration of an enormous intimate symbol. The normalization through architecture went beyond individual carvings. Entire buildings were designed as phallic monuments. The Meta Sudans fountain in Rome was essentially a 50-foot stone reproductive organ that spurted water from the tip. Citizens gathered around it for festivals, children played in its spray, and tourists posed for paintings with the giant fountain. It stood for centuries as a central Roman landmark. Private homes competed for the most impressive phallic displays. We have records of wealthy Romans commissioning ever larger Priapus statues, some with mechanical elements that allowed the reproductive organ to move or spray coloured water. Garden parties featured games where guests tried to throw rings onto statue appendages. The reproductive organ wasn't just normalized, it was entertainment. The commercial exploitation was systematic. Artisans specialized in creating phallic objects for every purpose. Reproductively shaped oil lamps lit Roman homes. Phallic wind chimes called tintinnabula hung in doorways. Reproductively, handled mirrors reflected Roman faces. Even furniture featured phallic elements, table legs, carved as reproductive organs, couch arms ending in symbolic tips. You couldn't escape genital imagery even trying. The graffiti adds another layer of normalized obscenity. Pompeii's walls preserve thousands of intimate messages and drawings. But these weren't hidden in back alleys. They're on main streets, public buildings, even temples. Children learning to write practiced by carving crude messages into public walls. The abundance suggests this wasn't rebellion but standard practice. The psychological impact of constant phallic exposure shaped Roman consciousness in ways we're only beginning to understand. Children raised surrounded by reproductive imagery developed completely different concepts of intimacy than modern humans. The phallus wasn't private or shameful. It was divine, protective, entertaining. This normalization enabled the intimate extremes described throughout this script. When reproductive organs are holy, anything involving them becomes religious act. Some Roman intellectuals tried to explain the obsession philosophically. They argued the phallus represented life force, creative power, the triumph of civilization over chaos. But the reality was cruder. Romans were a conquest culture that saw dominance as power, and they carved their worldview into stone. Every symbol pointing to an entertainment district, every priapus threatening punishment, every charm worn by children reinforced the message. Intimate dominance equals social dominance. The Christian reaction to Roman phallic culture was predictably extreme. When Christianity became the official religion, armies of workers were dispatched to destroy reproductive carvings throughout the empire. The systematic defacement gives us negative evidence. The careful chiseling away of intimate organs from statues shows how pervasive they were. Some estimates suggest millions of phallic images were destroyed in the Christian purge. But the influence persisted in hidden ways. Medieval churches incorporated subtle phallic imagery, supposedly to ward off evil. Renaissance artists rediscovered Roman erotic art and incorporated it into classical works. Even today, archaeologists regularly uncover new phallic artifacts, each one reminder of civilization that made the reproductive organ public art. Makes modern advertising look subtle, doesn't it? We debate whether billboards can show suggestive content, while Romans lived in cities where every street corner sported a reproductive symbol. The lasting influence on Western symbolism runs deeper than we admit. Every time we giggle at accidentally phallic architecture or corporate logos, we're channeling Roman consciousness that saw reproductive symbols everywhere because they literally were everywhere. So what does all this insanity tell us about human nature? Remember when I said every private moment could be your death sentence? Now you understand. I wasn't exaggerating. We've just traveled through 7 circles of Roman intimate hell, each more disturbing than the last. From laws that made certain positions punishable by death, to emperors who turned children into living servants, from women buried alive for experiencing pleasure, to competitions where people literally died for intimate records. Here's what ties all these horrors together. Rome didn't just have extreme intimate practices, it built an entire civilization on intimate terror. The hierarchy of dominance that destroyed careers, the criminalization of female pleasure that killed daughters, the virgin death cult that suffocated priestesses, the imperial corruption that industrialized abuse, the intimate competitions that gamified assault, the human demonstration manuals that broke bodies for education, the phallic monuments that made obscenity sacred. All of it was part of a systematic use of intimacy as a weapon of social control. The Roman Empire conquered the world through military might, but it controlled its own citizens through intimate legislation. Every bedroom became a battlefield where the wrong position meant social death. Every marriage bed became a courtroom where female pleasure was criminal evidence. Every virgin became a potential sacrifice to state security. Every child became potential imperial property. Every competition became a death match. Every demonstration became a torture session. Every street corner became a reproductive shrine. But here's the ultimate revelation. Rome fell not despite but because of intimate extremism. The same perversions that demonstrated imperial power also destroyed imperial humanity. Emperors who saw citizens as toys couldn't inspire loyalty. Senators who feared bedroom accusations couldn't govern effectively. Women trained to feel nothing couldn't raise healthy children. Men obsessed with dominance couldn't form stable partnerships. A civilization that turned intimacy into violence eventually tore itself apart. What Roman intimate history reveals about power and control should terrify us. When governments legislate what happens in bedrooms, when powerful men face no consequences for their appetites, when intimacy becomes performance rather than connection, when children are exposed to adult content as normal, when competition replaces intimacy, when bodies become demonstration tools, when obscenity becomes sacred, civilization doesn't become more sophisticated. It becomes more savage. The dangers of legislating intimacy echo through history. Every society that tried to control human intimacy through law created worse perversions than what it tried to prevent. Extreme religious repression, Victorian prudishness, puritanical extremes, all followed Rome's footsteps in trying to cage human nature through terror. The result is always the same. The repressed returns as sickness. The psychological damage from Roman intimate terror lasted generations. We inherited concepts of intimacy shaped by Roman extremes, the shame around pleasure, the power dynamics in bedrooms, the performance anxiety, the separation of intimacy from connection. Western civilization's confused relationship with intimacy traces directly back to Rome's toxic legacy. We're still recovering from their damage 2,000 years later. Next time you complain about dating apps, remember Roman women faking numbness to survive state-mandated marital relations. Your worst dating experience beats being buried alive for experiencing pleasure. Modern intimate freedom, the right to choose partners, positions, and pleasure, is a historical anomaly we take for granted. For most of human history, what happened in bedrooms was controlled by law, religion, and social terror. We live in paradise compared to Roman intimate terror. You can choose your partners without checking their legal status. You can experience pleasure without fearing execution. You can refuse advances without being murdered by your father. You can love whoever you want without being buried alive. You can compete intimately for fun rather than survival. You can learn about intimacy from books rather than broken human demonstrators. You can walk down streets without navigating by stone reproductive symbols. But here's why understanding this matters for modern society. The Roman impulses haven't disappeared. They've just gone underground. Every politician who legislates bedrooms channels Roman control. Every powerful person who abuses their position echoes imperial perversion. Every culture that shames female pleasure continues Roman misogyny. Every society that makes intimacy performance, rather than connection, follows Roman footsteps toward destruction. The Roman Empire shows us what happens when intimacy becomes a weapon, when private acts become performance, when power faces no boundaries, when law enters bedrooms, when children become objects, when competition replaces connection, when bodies become tools, when obscenity becomes normal. It's a warning written in stone symbols and buried virgins. Civilizations that weaponize intimacy destroy themselves from within. We have a choice. We can learn from Rome's catastrophic experiment in intimate control, or we can repeat their mistakes with modern variations. We can protect intimate freedom as a human right, or watch it erode through legislation and shame. We can treat intimacy as sacred personal connection, or reduce it to public performance and competition. We can protect children from adult content, or normalize their exploitation. We can see the warning signs, or ignore them until we're burying our own innocence. Subscribe for more disturbing historical truths they don't teach in school. Comment which Roman intimate horror shocked you most. Share this before it gets buried like a Vestal Virgin who dared to feel human. Because those who don't learn from history aren't just doomed to repeat it. They're doomed to repeat it in their bedrooms, their laws, and their children's lives. The Roman Empire conquered the world and then destroyed itself through intimate extremism. The question is, will we learn from their screams or add our own to history's chorus of intimate terror? The choice is ours. Choose wisely. Your civilization depends on it.